of Purim, where we spoke about what makes the wicked prosper and what gives wickedness or evil its viability, and then how that viability is taken away and evil ends. Generally, the experience of Purim was the first time that we as a people were in exile, the first danger that we faced while in exile. And it sets the tone for the whole idea of redemption versus exile. What really is the difference between the two? What do we lose when we're exiled? What do we gain in redemption? On the other hand, we celebrate Purim as a time of great redemption. As a matter of fact, we're told that when there's a leap year, and the month of Adar is repeated twice, rather than celebrating Purim in the first Adar, we celebrate it in the second Adar. And the Gemara tells us why. It's because we want to have one redemption next to the other. Meaning to say, the Exodus from Egypt being the first redemption, one redemption, we want to have the redemption of Purim as close as possible to the redemption of Pesach. So we celebrate Purim in the month of Adar that is closest to the month of Nisan, the month in which Pesach occurs. So the Gemara is actually comparing or equating what happened on Purim with the Exodus from Egypt, referring to both of them as redemption and wanting to have them as close together as possible. In the Exodus from Egypt, we actually left Egypt. Pharaoh was no longer able to do anything to us. We eventually got to Israel as part of the Exodus. Whereas in Purim, even though there was a redemption, the Gemara makes it very clear that after the redemption of Purim, we were still subjects of Achashverosh. And although Achashverosh had had a change of heart, and he was now friendly towards the Jew, but how safe is that? We're still under his rule, we're still subjects in his countries. So the redemption of Purim is on the one hand a redemption, a salvation, saved from a terrible fate, but on the other hand, not completely taken out of the condition that permitted that kind of threat and that kind of danger in the first place. So Purim is not only a time when we experience exile and we're saved from it, but rather a time when we experience galus, exile, and we're still experiencing it. We are still servants or subjects under one Achashverosh or another. Parenthetically, the thing with the coming out of Egypt and coming to Israel is somewhat surprising, and you don't really hear people talk about it much. And I wonder why the question isn't asked more often. Everyone knows exactly what day of the week, what day of the month, what day of the year, and exactly what hour of the day the Exodus from Egypt took place. We celebrate it on Pesach, we read about it in the Torah, we're told exactly when it happened. Isn't it strange that there is no celebration, there is no Yom Tov, there's no holiday marking the day we arrived in Israel? We traveled through the desert for 40 years on our way to Israel, and that is celebrated and remembered. We finally get there, and nobody even knows what day it was. Of course, historians know. If you're a scholar, you know. But the average person, who knows what day it was that the Jews arrived in Israel for the first time after coming out of Egypt? What month was it? Why is there no celebration? The answer that the Rebbe gives is that we have not yet come to Israel. We're still on our way. And even then, when the Jews did come into Israel, somehow they knew that this was not the real thing, that there would be an exile following, particularly since Moses told them that that might happen. Moshe says in the Torah, in his address to the Jews, he says, when you come to the land and you see the other people who are living there, and you're going to become curious about how they serve their gods, and you're going to mimic them, you're going to follow in their ways, and that's going to get you thrown out of Israel, and you're going to be scattered to the four corners of the earth, and then in the end of days God will bring you back. And then you will be in Israel for real, forever. And so they knew that coming into Israel, with all of its miracles, the walls of Jericho falling down and so on, it wasn't the real thing. And so no Yom Tov was made or established because it was not yet the real coming to the land of Israel. We've not yet reached the promised land. And the same is true today. We don't make a Yom Tov about our coming into Israel this time around because it's not yet the real thing. There's still a lot to be done. There's a lot to be gained. There's a lot to be accomplished. And therefore it is not yet the way the promised land is meant to be. When that does happen, and we finally do have the Israel that we're supposed to have, the way it's supposed to be in its final perfect form, we will have, undoubtedly, a Yom Tov celebrating that day. But going back to Purim, what exactly is the state of exile of Golus? The Torah describes exile as a time when God hides his face. God is hidden, concealed from us. In the time of Geula, the time of redemption, God is not hidden. He's not concealed, but rather open and obvious. Golus is a turning away. And that's why we find that Golus leaves us in what the Torah describes as the condition or the position of an abandoned wife, a woman whose husband has gone to sea and has left her. And that's why in the end of Golus, the prophet says that God will say to us, I may have left you for a while, but did I give you a divorce? I never divorced you. So there really was no actual severance of a relationship between the Jews and God, but there was a separation. There's a concealment. God is not as available, as open, as obvious, as immediately close as in the time of Geula. But it's significant that this concealment is described as the hiding of the face. The face, although it represents that part of the person that is most revealing, most expressive, it shows what's going on inside, and only on the face can you tell if the person is angry or happy, pleased or displeased, loving or hating. All of that shows not in the hands as much as in the face. So to say that the face is concealed would mean that we don't know the inner thoughts and inner feelings, even though we know that the person is there. Because even when you can't see a person's face and you see only his back, you're still seeing that person. You know that the person is there. Only you can't tell what he's thinking, you can't tell what he's feeling, because the face is concealed. But aside from that, there is a connection and an attachment that exists between God and Jews and the Jews and God that is stronger and deeper and more profound than the sharing of that which the face can express. So that even when we don't know the mood, when God is being distant, God is hiding his face, there is something in the relationship that not only remains, but actually becomes stronger. There's something of the essence that is touched and aroused when the face is concealed more than when the face is revealed. And that basically, in very simple terms, in terms of a husband and a wife, parents and children, any real relationship, you don't know the depth of the extent of the attachment and connection between two people until that connection has been threatened, until something comes between you. You don't know how attached you really are. And what that means is that the casual, everyday interactions that go on are not the full extent of the relationship. So we might say that there are three levels to a relationship. There are the externals, the superficialities, not represented by the face. Then there is the more intimate dimension, and that is revealed only in the face, through the face. And then there's the essence of the relationship that can't be expressed either in the superficialities or in the face. It is usually not revealed at all and not experienced until the two, both the superficial and the intimate, have been threatened or denied. And then you realize what the essence of the relationship is. The example of a father who loves his son But then the son does something terrible and angers the father. And the father is distant for a while. And when the son comes back and apologizes and corrects what he had done wrong and asks forgiveness, now the relationship is stronger than it was before. Why should a relationship become stronger as a result of disappointment or anger, something negative? So again, the reason is because the negative removed the other forms or the other dimensions of the relationship, the less essential parts. So what was left was the essence, and the essence is more palatable than the outer forms of relating. It's more permanent. More specifically, about God and the Jews, Hasidus brings a very enlightening analogy that helps us understand what Golus is. Hasidus describes the ultimate teacher and the ultimate student, the perfect teacher and perfect student, who are studying together. The teacher is devoted to teaching, and the student is devoted to learning. And so they're very devoted to each other. And they go along according to the study plan. They're progressing. And all of a sudden, the teacher decides that he wants to share something with the student that is not part of the study plan. It's something more, something deeper, something closer to the teacher's heart than what the student ordinarily would be ready to learn. So this presents a bit of a challenge. It's something that the student is not immediately or easily capable of grasping. But because of the devotion that the teacher has for the student, his personal interest in the student, he wants to tell him this greater lesson. He wants to give him this deeper insight. So what does he do? The teacher stops teaching and becomes lost in thought. He is going back and rethinking the subject so that he can word it in such a way that will enable the student to understand and appreciate what he's saying. So in a sense, the teacher retreats into his thoughts, in his own mind, and the student, being very devoted to his teacher, suddenly feels abandoned. The teacher is off in a different world now. He's not talking to the student. He's not sharing with the student. He's not even aware of the student. He seems to be 1,000,000 miles away, lost in thought. The student can't even begin to imagine or guess at what the teacher may be thinking. It's a totally different world from the world of the student. And so at first, the student will feel hurt. Why did the teacher suddenly lose interest? What did I do wrong? For what sin am I being abandoned and punished? But if he thinks about it a bit more, a little deeper, and he knows that the teacher has always been very devoted to him, that the teacher is not the kind of person who changes his mind, he's not a fickle person, he's not moody, and if he's devoted to a student, he is devoted and will remain devoted as long as the student will need him. So it can't be that the teacher has really abandoned him. What then is the teacher doing? At the end, the student will realize that the teacher was moved by a deeper feeling for the student than he had been experiencing all along, and the student realizes that what he thought was the most intimate, the most intense kind of relationship between a student and a teacher really wasn't that deep at all compared to what he is now going to receive. What had happened until now was superficial. Now we're getting around to the real relationship between student and teacher. This is going to be the real thing. Everything that preceded this was only on the surface. But he doesn't yet know what this is going to be. And he won't know until the teacher has finished making his preparations and presents the new lesson to the student. The previous Rebbe writes in his diary that there was a time when he was walking with his father, the Rebbe Rashab, in the streets of Germany, I think it was. They were walking along the street, and his father was explaining something to him, when all of a sudden his father became lost in thought. and so deeply lost in thought that the people passing them on the street would turn around and do a double take and look again, because the concentration on the Rebbe's face was so deep and so obvious that people were stunned by it. But the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, who was at the time 10 or 11 years old, writes in his diary how small and lost he suddenly felt, because here his father had been talking to him, they had been communicating, and then all of a sudden his father is in a different world. And he suddenly realizes, I'm just a child. Here I thought my father and I, we're talking, we're communicating. All of a sudden, what do you mean communicating? You and your father? Your father is off in heaven, and you're just a child left down here on earth. And he felt very bad. And that's the analogy that Chassidus gives about the teacher who is suddenly lost in thought and the student feels bad. So Golus is a time when God hides his face. And at first glance, we see it as a punishment. It's retribution, because we turned our back on God. Therefore God has turned his back on us. This is punishment. This is Golus. You're thrown out of the land of Israel. You're thrown out because you're bad. And on some level, of course, that's true. As we say in the davening, in the Musaf, we were thrown out of our land because of our sins. But that's not the whole story. That's not all of it. When we look a little bit deeper, we realize that it may not be for any sin of ours that we were thrown out of the land. It may not be that getting thrown out is a punishment at all. The fact that God's face has been turned from us is not necessarily an abandonment in the simple sense of the word. On the contrary, we lived in Israel, and we served God on a certain level. And it was in some ways too easy. After all, it is the Holy Land, and there was a holy temple, there were sacrifices, there were miracles. The whole place was enveloped and permeated with holiness. But somehow, that was not enough. The relationship that existed between God and the Jews was the relationship that you have face to face. It wasn't superficial, it was intimate. It was face to face, but it wasn't the essence, it wasn't the real thing. Simply, a Jew could make the mistake and think that a relationship between God and Jews depends on a Beis Hamikdash, depends on a temple. Word would get out. Jews relate to God through a temple, or through a sacrifice, or through a miracle. And that's not the truth. The relationship between God and Jews is much deeper than that, infinitely deeper. And so there had to come a time. God describes it as a moment. We describe it as 2,000 years. There had to be a time when that dimension of the relationship was discontinued, so that what else there is to the relationship, the essence of the relationship, would come to the surface. What is the essence of the relationship? So going back to the analogy of the student with the teacher, that feeling of yearning that comes in the first stage, when the child thinks he's been abandoned, before he is wise enough to know that it's not an abandonment at all, in that early stage, the child feels a great yearning, the student feels a great yearning to reconnect with his teacher. And that itself is a deeper experience than the feelings the student had all along while they were learning and going along in their ordinary routine, even though it was a good routine. It was a good teacher and a good student, and they were really learning. But that yearning that the student feels when the teacher stops teaching is so much deeper. It touches the student in a much deeper place than the pleasure that he had experienced during the ordinary teachings. Where does this deeper feeling come from? What arouses it? The fact that the teacher had also been moved by a deeper attachment, which is why he now wants to share something unusual with the student. And although the student doesn't consciously know that, but the fact that the teacher is experiencing this deeper feeling, this more essential connection with the student, communicates itself to the student, and arouses in the student an equal deepening of the relationship, a strong yearning, and that experience of a bond with the teacher that transcends the teaching. Because for the moment, the teacher isn't teaching. There's no lesson going on at all. And yet the student deeply yearns for the teacher himself. That's in the first stage. Concerning the relationship between God and Jews, there's also a first stage, the basic stage. Golus means when Jews are thrown into exile, scattered to the four corners of the earth. There is no Beis HaMikdash, there is no temple, there is no holy land, there are no miracles, and you would think that with all of this discontinued, the relationship would be over, just as the student who is not learning with his teacher thinks that the relationship is over. But we discover the exact opposite. It's precisely when those things are discontinued that we discover how deeply connected we really are with God. And as he says in the Psalms, my soul thirsts for you, my physical body withers from longing for you in a land of desolation without water. Now that kind of yearning, that kind of thirst, takes place only in a land that is desolate because there is no water. In other words, where all the other pleasures of the relationship between Jews and God is taken away, water here representing pleasure, then we discover that we are not connected to God because we enjoy Him, or to the degree that we enjoy Him. We're not connected to God only when we enjoy Him. God is not connected to us only when we are being nice and He's enjoying us. It goes beyond that. There's an essential bond that transcends even the pleasure of our relationship. And that creates the yearning. In spite of it all, what we really want is to be closer to God. And then he goes on in that psalm and he says, Halavai. Chassidus explains it to mean, Halavai. Would it be that when we come to Israel and Golus is over and we're no longer in the land of desolation and we no longer thirst for lack of water or for a lack of godliness, Halavai, then we should feel as strongly about God as we do now. And it's not wishful thinking. The purpose for Golus is so we discover and experience this deeper, more intense, more essential bond that we have with God, so that, or in such a way that when we do come to Geula, when Mashiach comes and we are taken out of Golus, we should never lose that intensity, because it wouldn't make sense to then slip back to a lesser relationship. So then, when we're taken out of Golus, we will have both things. We will have the essence of the relationship revealed on the level of the face-to-face relationship. So we will have the intensity of the connection without the loss of the water. So what the Jews discovered on Purim, the original Purim, is that number one, being thrown out of Israel, taken into captivity, scattered through the 127 countries which Achashverosh ruled, all of this is not abandonment. God has not abandoned us. And although in the Megillah God's name is not mentioned even once, which indicates the concealment of God that the Jews were experiencing at the time of Purim, at the same time, every word of the Megillah shouts, proclaims God's involvement with the Jews. So although His name is not mentioned, and there's a great concealment, yet the whole Megillah is telling us chapter after chapter that God is intimately involved in everything that happens to every Jew. So that combination, on the one hand the concealment, and on the other hand a profound involvement, that's what Golus is all about. And that's the first stage. Second stage, the student begins to realize that not only is this not a punishment, not only is this not an abandonment, this is the deeper feeling that the teacher has for the student, and what is happening is that there is a preparation for a deeper or higher, more profound, intimate teaching than has been shared between them until now. And then it's not only a yearning. The reaction or the response is not only a yearning for the teacher, a yearning to be closer in the analogy of the relationship between Jews and God. It's not only a desire to be closer to God. The Megillah says that after the miracle of Purim had happened, Haman was defeated, Jews prevailed over their enemies. We're then told that for the Jews there was light and rejoicing and gladness and honor, even though they were still very much in Golus. They still lived in the same countries, scattered all over the kingdom of Achashverosh, living under Achashverosh, and yet they had light and joy and gladness and honor. That's the second stage. That's not yearning. That's not like the deer in the desert who pants for water. This is joy. This is enthusiasm. This is glory, even while in exile. When we realize that not only do we have a deeper connection to God, and that even when He apparently abandons us, we want to go back to Him, we want to be close, we realize that there is no abandonment at all. On the contrary, there's only a deepening of the relationship. And when we realize that, this is a preparation for something deeper and higher, then the preparation itself becomes deeper and higher. Not a necessary evil. There's no such thing as a necessary evil with God. This distance, this darkness, this separation, which we call Golus, is a step up, not a step down. It's not even a step down which will help us get up. It is itself a step up. It's not a preparation for something good. It is good in and of itself. And that's when we get into the explanations about how we are sent to the four corners of the earth, not because we can no longer be in Israel, not because we don't deserve it. We were sent to the four corners of the earth because there's a mission for which our souls came down to earth. Every corner of the world needs to be subjected to godliness. And therefore, Jews have to be scattered all over the world, not in defeat, not in exile, scattered all over the world in order to bring the world to God. So rather than seeing ourselves as being banished from our land, we see ourselves as being on a mission not only to this world, which could be in Israel as well, Israel is part of this world, but a mission to every particular specific corner of the world, because no place is devoid of God, and that godliness that exists in every place and in every corner of the world has to be found, activated, realized, brought to the surface, revealed, and reconnected with its source. And that happens through a Jew. The Baal Shem Tov says that wherever a Jew goes, he brings with him, carries with him godliness. A Jew is traveling and makes the wrong turn on the road, and he ends up someplace he had never intended to be. But while he's there, he drinks something or eats something and makes a bracha. That bracha was the purpose for which God led him purposefully on this path, which he himself had never intended to follow, on this road that he had not intended to travel down. God took him down that road because that water or that food or that place, that geographical location, needed godliness brought to it. And so the Jew is brought there by divine providence, so that he will make the bracha, do the mitzvah, daven mincha, wash his hands before eating. He would bring the potential godliness that had existed in this place all these years since creation to the surface. And the Jew who does this is not arbitrarily chosen. It's not that any Jew could have done that. Every Jew is given a certain amount of godliness and a certain area of the world that is his responsibility, his soul's responsibility, to bring out the godliness in those places. So it's not that some Jew had to go there and make a bracha. It is precisely the Jew who ends up there who needed to be there, because this is his spot in the world that he has to elevate. It is part of his soul's mission. And the Rebbe takes it a step further. Suppose a Jew is traveling down the road, he makes the wrong turn, winds up in a place he never expected to find himself, and he doesn't make a bracha, because he doesn't eat anything, he doesn't drink anything, and he doesn't wash his hands, and he doesn't do any mitzvah. He goes, he realizes he's in the wrong place, he turns around and he leaves. So he didn't do anything godly there. So what was the point? Why did God take him there if he wasn't going to do a mitzvah? So the Rebbe explains that there are 6 mitzvahs that a Jew does constantly. Mitzvahs like not believing in idols, having no other gods, is a mitzvah that we're constantly performing. Not giving in to our evil inclination, not following the temptations of the heart, that's a constant mitzvah. Whenever you're not following the temptations of the heart, you're fulfilling that mitzvah. Loving God, believing in God's oneness, these are constant mitzvahs. There is no time when you're not fulfilling those mitzvahs. And therefore, the Jew is traveling down the road, lost in thought about whatever it may be, and realizes that he's on the wrong highway, and then he turns around and goes back. While he was traveling down the wrong highway, he believed in God. He did not believe in idols, was not giving in to the temptations of his heart. Or while he was traveling down that road, he carried within him a love for a fellow Jew, and that itself is a mitzvah, even though you're not doing anything for your fellow Jew. But the fact that you love your fellow Jew, you're concerned for your fellow Jew, you feel connected to your fellow Jew, that itself is a mitzvah. So a mitzvah was performed at that place, the place you never intended to be in, and you've brought godliness to that place. That geographic location supported a mitzvah because you were traveling down that road, and while traveling down that road, you were carrying your faith with you, your commitment, your Jewish soul. So that wherever a Jew goes, even if he doesn't do any particular mitzvah, any act of mitzvahs, he's bringing godliness to that place because a Jew carries godliness within him at all times. And then we begin to see Golus not as banishment, not as being driven out of the land. On the contrary, in Israel things were very nice. We could compare it to a honeymoon, but there was more to be done. We are capable of greater things, and we're destined for greater things. Golus is, on this deeper second stage level, it is a greater thing if we appreciate Golus for what it really is. Because it's a step towards something higher. A step towards something higher is itself higher. One of the previous Rebbes said that when Mashiach comes, after Mashiach comes, we will long, we will miss the experience of Golus. And that certainly can't be something that comes as a punishment for sins. We say in the davening it's because of our sins that we were sent out of our land. And yet here we're saying that Golus is not really such a bad thing at all. It's explained in Kabbalah and Chassidus that the world has to be elevated, and therefore we're here to do an important job, so it's not really that bad at all. So what is it? Is it a punishment or isn't it? And this is an important concept in all of Torah, and that is that when we use the word chet, which means simply translated sin, as we say, because of our sins we were exiled from our land, what exactly does the word chet mean? It is normally translated as sin, but chet also means off target. Off target. So that when something is good, but not exactly, precisely good, even though it has nothing to do with sin, we use the same word. We use the word chet to indicate that this virtue is somewhat off-center and off-target and not perfect. So when we say that because of a sin we were banished from our land, it doesn't necessarily mean that we did something terrible, some monstrous crime for which we are being punished. No. We were committed, and we were good, and we were following God's commandments, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't on target. It wasn't bull's eye. And therefore, we have to leave Israel in order to get to that perfect bull's eye, in order to get oriented towards the essence, so that we see the very center, the very essence of our relationship. So when we say in the davening, because of our chet, we were thrown out of the land, it means because it wasn't enough, the mitzvahs we were doing in Israel. So we went on to do more. And the same is true when we say that Adam and Chava sinned. Adam and Eve committed a sin. The sin doesn't necessarily mean a grave violation. It means a goodness that is something short of perfect. It's understandable that as long as Jews are not on target, as long as we're not in touch with the very essence of our relationship, and there is still something missing, it's understandable that on the lower levels, meaning to say for the people who are not as inspired and as learned or as devoted as they should be, this lack, this imperfection makes it possible for them to actually sin in the literal sense. So the two are not separate, but very much interrelated. When on a whole, the Jewish people are not at their peak, and we haven't yet reached our essential relationship with God, on some level God is going to permit the lowest of the low to actually go out and sin. So when we say because of our sins we were thrown out of the land, of course there were actual sins, but they may not have been very common. What was more common is that we were not yet at that time where we needed to be. And that itself will sooner or later produce a sin somewhere along the line. So why were we thrown out of the land of Israel? Because we were terrible? Who was terrible? How many people sinned? 10 people? 100 people? The fact that 100 people sinned means that all of us are not where we should be. Because if most of us were really in touch with the essence of the relationship, that would have a ripple effect on the rest of the people, and nobody would sin. So we were thrown out of our land to become what we need to become. And what will happen then? Then we will have reached the essence of our relationship, and there will be no possibility of sin. One comes with the other. So basically, there are two levels on which Purim is appreciated. When we thought we were abandoned and realized we were not, we come to understand two things. Either that we were not abandoned because we still yearn for God in spite of the abandonment, in spite of the darkness, so that we will survive the abandonment and we will actually grow stronger from it. The second realization, which is the higher realization, is that there is no abandonment. There is no darkness, there's no separation. We're sent on a mission, on a higher mission. Golus is then a step up, not a step down at all. So when we say we want Mashiach, why doesn't he come already? And then we are certain that he is coming, and he's coming now, he's got to come today. Again, we come to those statements on two levels. Either we're saying, we've been longing for God for so long, we've been going on, we've been carrying on in spite of the darkness for so long. Why doesn't it end already? How much can we take of this darkness? On the second level, we've accomplished so much already. We've done everything that needs to be done. The Jews have been scattered to the four corners of the earth in order to bring it to godliness. We've brought godliness to every place in the world. So what more is there to do? If we've done it all, Mashiach must come now. So in experiencing the transformation, going from feeling lost to regaining our bearing, to know what is going on and what is the purpose behind it all, we actually experience Purim. In our private lives, whenever things get out of hand, and we don't understand what's going on, why is God doing this, or why is He not doing that? Whatever it is that throws us off balance, and we begin to wonder whether we've been abandoned, whether He cares anymore, that's the threat of Purim. The difficult time of Purim. But then, to regain our balance, we look a little bit closer at what our teacher is doing, or in this case, what God is doing, and we know that He can't possibly be abandoning us. There's that famous little story about the old elderly couple who are driving along in their old car, and the wife says to the husband, she says, "Sam, look at us. Look at how we're sitting in the car. You're sitting at that end of the seat, and I'm sitting over on this end of the seat. Remember when we were first married, we sat close to each other. So what's happened, Sam? Why did you move away?" And Sam, sitting behind the steering wheel, says, "I didn't move away." He says, "Ever since we're married, I drive the car. I'm always sitting by, I have to sit by the wheel. If I let go of the wheel, we're going to crash. So I'm always sitting by the wheel. If anyone has moved away, it must have been you." So we know that God can't abandon us, otherwise we'd crash. We are an inseparable part of God, and therefore there can't be an abandonment. God can't abandon Himself. So what is this? So we have to be like the wise student who sees past the superficial separation and realizes that the teacher wants something good for the student, a greatness, a virtue that the student doesn't yet suspect, doesn't yet imagine that such a virtue or such a greatness exists. Teacher wants for him what he himself would never come to on his own. And that's where we are in this end of Golus, in the final days of Golus. Although we're still in exile, but we're capable, and it's necessary that we appreciate the Golus and see it in its proper light, and therefore not only continue to yearn for godliness in spite of the darkness, but to actually have light and joy and rejoicing and honor even the few moments that are left to the Golus, to the coming of Mashiach. In practical terms, people in the times of Purim didn't know where to put their trust. Here they were thrown out of Israel, and they don't know what they're going to do next. They lived under Nebuchadnezzar, and it was terrible, and they felt that their existence was in danger, the very existence of the Jew. Then along comes Achashverosh and invites them to this party that he made for all the citizens of his countries. And Jews are invited, no longer second-class citizens. And not only are Jews invited to the party, but they are told that they can order kosher wine, kosher meat, anything they need to satisfy their dietary requirements. Achashverosh made a point of serving food to satisfy Haman and Mordechai, and to each his own. Whatever the person requested or needed was served. In order to enjoy the party, all of these things were made available. So there was food there that Mordechai could eat. Glatt kosher, and wine that Mordechai could drink. And this made the Jews feel very secure. After all, this is not only a king, an ordinary king. This is a king who rules over 127 countries. a powerful man, and he likes the Jews. So the Jews breathed a sigh of relief and felt that their existence was now assured. But it didn't take very long for that to fall apart. Haman came along, he got the king's ear, and soon everything was terrible for Jews. So Mordechai comes and says, now will you go back to doing what Jews always do? Will you go back to living like a Jew? Here we are faced with annihilation, God forbid, simply because we trusted in nature. We decided to be like other peoples. Other people know that if you have a strong friend, a strong ally in high places, that guarantees your safety. To whatever degree a country's safety can be guaranteed. But that's true for other people. It's not true for us. That's not how we survive. Other people are not in exile. We are in exile. By natural means, we will not survive. We have no business surviving by natural means. Nature dictates that we can't survive. What then is our survival? Our survival is that we represent God. The part of us that is God, that part of us is indestructible. Nature or no nature. And when we're connected and dependent on that part of us, on our special relationship with God, then our existence is guaranteed, which would mean in practical terms that when it comes to doing mitzvahs, to doing what God created us for and sent us into this world for, no argument, no condition in nature can ever change or interfere or even discourage the Jewishness of a Jew. I have a classical example. We heard this young Russian chassid talk about how he was raised in Russia and how even when he was going to grade school in the communist school system, he would not attend on Shabbos. And for a while he managed to get away with it. And that's because the Lubavitchers in Russia, inspired by the previous Rebbe, vowed not to be impressed or depressed by anything in the world that would threaten to compromise their Yiddishkeit. And so they went about doing their mitzvahs the way they would if there were no Stalin, as if there was no communism. And although it cost them, yet they survive. Other forms of Yiddishkeit, other groups did not survive with their Yiddishkeit intact. The difference is that if you think that you have to abide by the laws of nature in order to survive, that's the mistake that the people made in the times of Purim. When a person says, I can't put on tefillin because Stalin won't let. I can't teach my kids Aleph Beis because this is Russia. If we think that way, then our existence is in danger. The truth is that no condition, no person in God's world says everything here is created by God, and therefore it was not meant to, and therefore can't stop a Jew, get in the way, and prevent a Jew from doing mitzvahs. Because God doesn't contradict himself. He says that you should do the mitzvah, and he creates Russia and Stalin and communism. But he's not contradicting himself. Stalin has to do what Stalin was created to do. And we have to do what we were created to do. Stalin is part of nature. Sooner or later, he'll die. He'll be finished. It'll be over. We are not part of nature. Yiddishkeit will continue. The Jewish people are forever. And that's the fact. So this kid comes out of Russia after 60 years of Stalinism, and Stalinism is dead, communism is in trouble, and this kid wears his tzitzis hanging out, doesn't go to school on Shabbos. So by realigning ourselves, reminding ourselves that our existence comes from mitzvahs, from things that are higher than nature, and that cannot be threatened at all by what goes on within nature, and on the contrary, the mitzvahs that we do dictate how the world will turn out and what will become of nature rather than the other way around. And that is the story of Purim. And that's how the month of Adar is described. The month that Haman thought he could prevail against the Jews, and it was turned around, transformed, and the Jews prevailed against Haman. What does it mean? V'nahapechu, transformed. Reverse your priorities. It's not nature that dictates when and if you can do mitzvahs. Mitzvahs dictate where and when nature can exist. And that is the transformation of Purim.